Hello, my name is Carolyn Lammersfeld. I'm the Vice President of Integrative Oncology for Cancer Treatment Centers of America. We're here today to talk about healthy eating and cancer risk reduction. So some of the things we'll talk about are reviewing the population dietary guidelines, discussing the impact of obesity on cancer risk. We'll cover a little bit about physical activity and spend the majority of time talking about what a plant-focused diet might look like. One of the things I always like to start any talk about nutrition with is a reminder that nutrition is a science. And so the more we study things in this area, the better the studies are, the more we learn. So sometimes recommendations do change, which can be confusing, can lead us to believe we're getting mixed messages. So I like the example of nuts. 30 years ago, nuts really weren't considered something that could be included in a healthy diet. And then as we learn more about the type of fat in nuts and some of the other compounds in nuts that when eaten in small amounts potentially may be helpful for heart health, some of that thinking changed. Another thing I want to remind people is sensation cells. So sometimes we have to look at guidelines and go a little deeper. So in 1984, a very famous magazine had on their cover a picture of 2 eggs and bacon in a smiley face, pretty much saying cholesterol caused heart disease, and eggs and bacon were off the menu for breakfast. And then 30 years later, that same magazine actually had a cover with big pieces of butter, and the headline was, eat butter, what the scientists got wrong. And again, you have to go behind the headline there because it didn't necessarily put butter on the list of health foods and didn't drastically change some of the guidelines. However, what we learned over those 30 years is when individuals replaced calories with processed carbohydrates and sugars, so they were eating that instead of saturated fat, it was actually not necessarily a good thing for their risk of heart disease. So many of the recommendations we have today have a lot of things in common, whether we're looking at the American Cancer Society, the American Institute for Cancer Research, American Heart Association. When we look at reducing the risk of cancer and other chronic diseases, the recommendations have the following in common. Number one is we really need to work on achieving and maintaining a healthy body weight, and we'll talk more about why that's very important as it relates to cancer risk. Moving from a sedentary lifestyle to a more physically active lifestyle, we know roughly 75% of Americans are not meeting activity guidelines, so most people have work to do there. And then we're going to talk about limiting calories from added sugars, saturated fat, and for many people, reducing sodium. And again, focusing very, very heavily on how do we shift from red meat to more of a plant-based diet that includes some fish. Clearly not smoking or avoiding tobacco products is part of all guidelines. We're not going to cover that in any detail today. And then using caution with alcohol. Most of the recommendations for cancer prevention really say to limit or avoid alcohol. If you do drink, even small amounts can increase the risk of many cancers. So the current recommendation is that women stick to no more than 1 drink per day and men 2. And that's as much as we're going to cover about alcohol today. So let's look at nutrition and cancer prevention. What is the evidence? So over the last 30, 40 years, in roughly 1981, researchers estimated that 35% of all cancers were related to poor diet choices. And shortly after that, the American Institute for Cancer Research was founded, whose main mission is to study the impact of diet activity on cancer risk. They also have some recommendations for treatment and survivorship. And then roughly over the subsequent 30 years, the American Institute for Cancer Research published 3 expert reports summarizing nearly 1 million studies on diet and cancer. And so we're going to delve into that a little further today. And those informations are available on aicr.org. American Institute for Cancer Research has 10 recommendations for cancer prevention. We're going to focus on the ones most related to diet and lifestyle today. So again, number 1 being a healthy body weight, and we'll talk about why that's number 1 on the list. Being physically active, eating a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans with some fish. And so if that sounds a little bit like a Mediterranean diet, it is very similar. Limiting consumption of fast foods and other processed foods that are high in fat, starches, or sugars. And we're going to talk quite a bit about sugar and limiting that. And then limiting consumption of red meats, such as beef, pork, and lamb. And yes, pork is a red meat, and processed meats. So that brings us back to the bacon. We haven't necessarily changed our thinking as it relates to bacon and other processed meats. Limiting consumption of sugar-sweetened drinks. And we talked about alcohol, and some of the other guidelines are more outside the realm of this talk from a diet perspective. Achieving and maintaining a healthy body weight is number one on the list when we look at recommendations for lifestyle and cancer prevention. And you may ask, why does that matter? We now know obesity is linked to at least 13 different types of cancer, including postmenopausal breast and colorectal cancers, and may increase the risk of some cancers by up to 40%. Why are we so concerned? We can see we have an obesity epidemic in this country, with nearly 72% or 99 million of Americans being either overweight or obese. And 40% of them, or 70 million of US adults, are actually in that obese category, where they're carrying extra body weight, and we'll talk about why that may be concerning as it relates to cancer risk. The other startling statistic is there are some projections that that number may approach 50%, so 1 in 2 Americans may be in that obese category within the next 10 years. Even more concerning is 19% of our youth, or 13.7 million young people, are in that obese category. And what does that mean for them? So again, as we talk about this today, it's always better when you implement diet and lifestyle changes that you look at in the context of family settings and who you may be enjoying meals with. So we know based on that obesity factor that nearly 1 in 3 children will develop diabetes in their lifetime. Type 2 diabetes, or what we sometimes think of as adult onset diabetes, we're seeing in children now. And we're seeing heart disease risk factors in obese children that usually we only saw in adults. There are, again, some estimates that this generation of children may not outlive or live as long as their parents, and that is very concerning. So roughly 6 years ago, the American Society for Clinical Oncology put out really a call to address obesity, and that's why you're seeing this focus on that as the number one risk factor to address. And the headline when some of this came out was, "Is obesity the new smoking?" So based on the statistics, with potentially 50% of Americans being obese in the next 10 years, there is a thought that obesity may, in that time, replace smoking as the number one modifiable risk factor for cancer. So if we look at the current numbers, roughly 84,000 incidents of cancer currently are related or associated with obesity, and nearly 1 in 5 deaths. And again, if we look at that projection of 50% of Americans being obese in the next 10 years, that 84,000, which is the size of a large football stadium of people where their cancer may be related to carrying extra body weight, 10 years from now, that number may be 500,000. So that is like the population of a large city, for example, Atlanta, that number of people having a cancer that might be attributed to carrying extra body weight. So the silver lining in this is we're starting to see studies and even modeling studies, projections that small amounts of weight loss can actually have an impact and lower risk. So some suggestions, a 1% decrease in body mass index, which is one of the indicators we look at to categorize individuals as being overweight or obese, a 1% decrease in body mass index could potentially decrease 100,000 new cases of cancer. Sometimes the logical question is, how does extra body weight increase risk? We used to think of body fat as something we had to keep us warm, protect our organs from shock, and maybe we would be concerned about it for cosmetic reasons, but we're now learning that fat is much more active and concerning than that. Fat may have effects on cell growth that could potentially be one of the reasons obesity increases risk of cancer. Obese people tend to have increased levels of insulin and insulin-like growth factor, which can act as a promoter for the development of certain cancers. We know fat tissue produces excess estrogen, which is associated with breast, endometrial, and other hormone-related cancers. And obese people may have more chronic inflammation, which is associated with increased risk of cancer. So with that in mind, I very much recognize that losing extra weight, particularly in our current culture where food is everywhere, you can dial it up and have it delivered on an app. there are some things we can look to that may be helpful for individuals trying to lose extra body weight. So the National Weight Control Registry is a registry of 10,000 or more individuals who have lost significant amounts of weight and kept it off for at least a year. And what we've learned from that is individuals that have been successful losing weight have some things in common. So just under 50%, 45% were able to lose weight on their own, while 55% used a program to lose weight. Not surprisingly, nearly 100%, 98% modified their diet in some way, and 94% increased activity, with walking being the most common. When they looked at the diet changes people made, the most common one was individuals, not surprisingly, following a low-calorie, but also a low-fat diet with the activity. Again, that is one approach. We know there are a number of evidence-informed diets that have helped individuals lose weight and keep it off. So for some people, a lower carbohydrate approach may be appropriate. For some other individuals, using a meal replacement or two in a day may be an equally effective approach, and a Mediterranean diet has been shown to help some individuals lose weight. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that style of eating in a little bit here. 78% of individuals in this registry ate breakfast daily, so that is certainly an important thing to think about if you're looking to lose extra weight. And 75% weighed themselves weekly. 62% of people who lost weight and kept it off for an extended period of time watched less than 10 hours of TV per week, so they got up off the couch and moved more. 90% exercising on average 1 hour per day, again with walking being the most common. So in addition to helping burn extra calories, if you're trying to lose extra weight, some of the other benefits of physical activity is it can help maintain muscle and bone health, which is important as we age. It can decrease inflammation and disease risk. We talked a little bit about obesity, inflammation, and risk of cancer. May also decrease risk of heart disease and help, again, if you're trying to lose extra weight, it may help with appetite, help you sleep, which is important if you're trying to lose weight as well, and help with mood. So how much physical activity is needed? We learned from the National Weight Control Registry that individuals exercise 60 minutes a day to help with weight loss. If we look at cancer prevention guidelines, the American Cancer Society, for example, recommends 150 minutes of moderate exercise, so something like walking per week. And that might be 5 30-minute sessions. If you do vigorous activities, so if you're a runner, heavy biking, mountain climber, that 150 minutes is more like 75 minutes of vigorous activity. And again, if you haven't been active, it's important to talk to your doctor about whether it's okay for you to engage in physical activity and work up to it. Once you meet these guidelines, then it's also good to think about adding some strength training and flexibility and balance in work, something like yoga or Pilates, to help round out your fitness routine. Again, looking at that 150 minutes a week, it can be overwhelming if you haven't been active. So you want to build up to it, and it's perfectly okay to take that 30 minutes I mentioned and break it up into 3 10-minute sessions or 2 15-minute sessions, whatever you need to do to meet that guideline. I think it's also important to think about barriers that might make it difficult for us to maintain that level of activity. So if you're a social person, you may want to find a partner to exercise with that can also hold you accountable. You may want to look into a gym or a class where you'll be exercising with people that can also help hold you accountable if you don't show up for class. And also think about the environment depending upon where you live. If walking is going to be your activity and weather may be a factor of whether you go out and walk, what is your backup plan? Are you going to go to a mall to walk or a gym to walk? So again, it's as I mentioned with losing weight, we often know what we need to do, but there are many things that get in our way and challenge us. There's a number of different ways you can track your activity now. So think about getting a step counter using the apps on your smartphones to track. One thing that is effective for individuals is trying to shoot for 10,000 steps a day, which will often get you into that recommended level of activity as well. So moving from activity to diet, which is really the main focus for today, if we look at the American Institute for Cancer Research guidelines, the American Cancer Society guidelines, all the population guidelines we have for what type of diet may be associated with reducing risk of some cancers, it all points towards moving towards a a plant-based, plant-forward approach where we're focusing and getting more of our calories from whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans. I like to talk about this as eating more foods without labels, so eating fresh foods, less processed and fast foods. You've probably heard about shopping the perimeter of the grocery stores, but that's really where the best foods are for your overall health. So why do we talk about these foods? They can potentially directly have impact. So things like fruits and vegetables, components in beans can have direct impact on your cells and potentially protect the DNA in your cells from the type of damage that can eventually lead to cancer. But they also indirectly can help us achieve and maintain a body weight. So fruits and vegetables, in addition to being full of vitamins, minerals, and other compounds that again can help protect our cells, are also low-calorie choices that may help individuals achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. It's also important to eat the right portion. We have labels that give us serving sizes, and often our portions are much bigger than what is on the label. So paying attention to the portion you eat can help with achieving and maintaining a healthy body weight. And again, eating more of these plant-based foods, which are high in fiber, sometimes can help us feel full and crowd out some of the less healthy foods we may want to have in our diet. So let's talk a little bit more about fruits and vegetables. Again, we're talking about a plant-based approach, so fruits and vegetables are a big part of that. They're loaded with fiber, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and phytochemicals, which are compounds in foods that we don't necessarily have to have in our diet, like vitamins and minerals, but they have activity at the cellular level, again, potentially protecting DNA from damage that can lead to the types of changes in cells that can lead to cancer. So when we look at fruits and vegetables, ideally we say try and eat a rainbow of color every day. So if you can get something red, orange, purple, yellow every day, you'll be getting more of those phytochemicals and a variety of those phytochemicals that have activity at our cellular level. So look, the brighter the color, the better, and the brighter the color, the more nutrition. Normally, when we encourage people to eat more fruits and vegetables, the next question is, do I need to eat organic? Does it all have to be organic? And the simplified answer to that is no. The literature suggests that even if you're eating commercially grown produce, the benefits of all those vitamins, minerals, fiber, phytochemicals exceed any potential risk of synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. However, if you have access to and can afford organic produce, it might be something to think about. So what does that mean? It means when you buy organic, it means the produce hasn't been irradiated, they haven't used genetically modified organisms or GMOs, and synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, other chemical additives haven't been used in the growing process. I think it's also important to remember if you're eating animal foods, meat and dairy products, again, that's something to consider whether you have access to and can afford organic, which then means the animals haven't been raised with hormones or antibiotics. One of the resources we use to help individuals make decisions about whether to buy organic or not, because it can be expensive, is the Environmental Working Group. So they regularly put out a list of what they call the Dirty Dozen when it relates to produce, and the Clean 15. So the Dirty Dozen are the 12 or 13 fruits and vegetables that have the highest pesticide residues on them. So for example, strawberries, spinach, nectarines, that is produce where you may want to consider buying organic, whereas the Clean 15 have much lower levels of pesticide residues on them. If you think of things like avocados, cantaloupes, and melons, which have a thick skin or rind that you're going to wash and remove, you can imagine why that may be the case. That also brings up a recommendation. So the decision to do organic a lot of times is based on access and budget. And so if you're doing conventional produce, there are things you can do to reduce exposure, like washing well, trimming outer leaves off of greens, and getting a variety of fruits and vegetables so you're not exposing yourself to the same compounds on a regular basis. So I did mention with animal foods as well, you may want to consider organic if you want to minimize your exposure to hormones and antibiotics. The other way to do that is to limit consumption of these foods, which is one of the recommendations for a healthy diet for cancer risk reduction. So the current recommendation from the American Institute for Cancer Research is to limit consumption of red meats, so that's beef, pork, lamb, veal, to 12 to 18 ounces per week. So some of the strategies or tips you can use to do that if you're currently eating larger amounts of meats is to think about using smaller amounts of meat to complement a meal. So if you think of something like a stir fry where you have a whole grain like quinoa or brown rice and lots of vegetables and maybe only a small amount of meat, you'll be full and satisfied compared to eating a larger portion of meat. Similarly, like fajitas, you're using maybe a whole grain tortilla with small amounts of meat and lots of vegetables as a filling for the fajitas. Salads are an obvious one. I don't think I need to go too far there, although if you're cooking whole grains like quinoa, brown rice on the weekends or earlier in the week, you can always rework some of those into salads. And that kind of brings me to beans, which is another thing you can prepare ahead and work into different meals throughout the week. And many people that are successful, this is one of the techniques they use. They prepare foods once or twice a week in larger volumes and then rework them into different meals throughout the week. So if you're eating less red meat, one of the questions is, how do you make sure you're getting enough protein? And so one of the recommendations is to move towards more dried beans, peas, and lentils as a meat replacement for meals. You've probably heard of meatless Mondays. So if you're currently not eating beans, that's a good way to start, one day a week, eating beans instead of meat, and then increasing as you're able to, keeping in mind that a lot of these foods we're talking about are very high in fiber. And if you're not eating a lot of fiber in your diet, which the majority of Americans aren't, you want to do this gradually as well so that your digestive tract has time to adjust to that fiber and the contents in beans. Drink plenty of water so that your digestive tract can adapt to this type of eating. So with beans, thinking about planning a meal around a bean soup, stew, or chili versus a piece of meat, you can get whole grains, vegetables, beans for protein, everything really in one meal, and maybe you supplement that with some cornbread or fruit salad, but it's really rethinking what a meal may look like. Beans work really well in burritos and tacos. Thinking of bean spreads, maybe you've tried hummus with vegetables, dipping into that for lunch. And then poultry is certainly something that can be used as a substitute for red meat. We think of that as sort of a neutral protein source. It's not on any of the lists to avoid. So it's certainly a good substitute for red meat. The current recommendation from the American Institute for Cancer Research is to limit or avoid processed meats. So there's the bacon, sausage, deli meats. So if you are eating some of that would really count towards the allotment for the week as well. And then one of the beneficial things in addition to beans to add to your diet would be fish. So ideally, if you could add fish 2 to 3 times per week for the omega-3 fatty acids, which is a type of fat that may help with inflammation, may also help from a heart healthy standpoint. So when we talk about what type of fish, we generally recommend cold water ocean fish for the omega-3 content. So some examples would be cod, salmon, some forms of tuna, halibut. And again, the portion size isn't large, 3 to 4 ounces twice a week. One of the things I like about fish is it's quick to prepare. So again, some of these things don't have to be time consuming. The question we often get when we're recommending people eat more fish is, what about mercury? Do I have to be concerned with mercury? And we have good guidelines that we can look to make sure our fish is safe from that standpoint. Again, we're going back to portions, keeping the portion to about 4 ounces for adults and 1 ounce for small children to age 2 to 3, which increases to 4 ounces by age 11. So controlling the portion minimizes concerns about mercury. Eating smaller fish. So some of the lowest choices from a mercury standpoint that can be eaten 2 to 3 times a week include, as I mentioned, cod, salmon, and some types of tuna. So for example, skipjack, I know is popular right now. That is on the low mercury food choices. Moderate choices, generally the recommendation is trying to limit them to once a week. So that would be fish like grouper, halibut, and then white tuna, albacore, yellowfin, and then avoiding some fish with the highest mercury content. So that would be things like king mackerel, orange roughy, swordfish, and big eye tuna. Another important thing to keep in mind is if you're eating freshwater fish that you or someone you know has caught and shared with you, there are concerns with mercury there too. So larger fish like carp, catfish, there are often advisories for those fish due to mercury content or other contaminants. You can do an online search for fish advisories and pretty easily find a search engine that will help you identify if a certain type of fish in your area is safe to eat or not. Most of these recommendations that are easily found with an online search do apply to pregnant women and children, but I think it's always important if you're pregnant that you talk to your physician about how much fish and what type of fish, as well as for children, particularly under the age of 2, to talk with your pediatrician. For more information about mercury or other contaminants as it relates to fish, you can do an online search for fish advisories. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and FDA have good resources as well. So let's move on to the recommendation to limit consumption of sugar-sweetened drinks, which is a little non-specific. So I like to look to the American Heart Association for a more specific recommendation about sugar intake in general. So the American Heart Association recommends that women consume no more than 6 teaspoons or 24 grams of sugar a day, and men 36 grams or 9 teaspoons a day, which sounds like a lot, but when we start looking at the amount of added sugar in many of our foods, it adds up very quickly. So the typical American consumes 2 to 3 times this amount, so 22 teaspoons per day or 89 grams of sugar. And if you consider the number of calories that come there without a lot of other nutrients, it can make it very difficult for individuals to achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. So why might people be consuming 2 to 3 times the amount they should? If we think about added sugars, they're really any type of sugar or syrup that's added to food during the processing or preparation, including what we might add in beverages or at the table. So one of the main sources of sugar in our diet are sodas, so hence the recommendation to limit consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. So that could be soda, juice drinks, sport drinks, sweet tea. But if we look at other areas, so sweetened beverages are the number one source of sugar and what we might call empty calories in the American diet. But number 2 are the obvious things we think of as sugary foods or sweets, candies, pastries, cakes. But we also get sugar that we might not even realize or think about in our condiments. So for example, there's sugar in ketchup, barbecue sauce, tomato sauce. And if you're looking at a few grams in each of those, you could see how that could add up in a course of a day. Many yogurts are sweetened with added sugars in addition to the naturally occurring sugar in yogurt. Coffee creamers, flavored coffee creamers. So all of that adds up. I think it's also important to remember there are, if we're reading food labels, which is very helpful for monitoring the amount of sugar intake you're getting, and also if you're trying to cut back. So I think it's important to know that there are at least 50 names for sugars that we might see on food labels. So sugar's an obvious one. Anything ending in an OSE, O-S-E, so glucose, dextrose, fructose, all of that is sugar, but also agave and honey, syrup, anything like that is adding sugar to our diet. So I mentioned food labels. That is really one way to get a handle on how much sugar you may be consuming and use that to monitor your intake if you're trying to cut back. So the good news is the FDA is doing a rollout implementation of some changes with our food labels that will make it easier to monitor added sugars. So we're already starting to see labels that have added sugar as a line item, and you can be sure that is something that I mentioned is been added to the food. It's not naturally occurring. So within the next year or less, we will see that on all food labels. So you'll be able to look at a label. So for example, yogurt, and see total sugars and then added sugar. So you can know the difference is naturally occurring sugar and the added sugar is called out as a separate line item. So I mentioned this adds up really quickly. So if we look at the recommendation to limit consumption of sugar-sweetened beverage, and we look at a 12-ounce soda, for example, having 39 grams of sugar, a 12-ounce sweet tea having 35 grams of sugar, and some of the sweetened vitamin waters, there are those that do not have sweetener, but can also containing 33 grams of sugar. You can see where one of those beverages would put most people at the recommended level for a day. If you look at some of the fancy coffee beverages we have available to us on every corner now, many of those have 47 grams of sugar, which would exceed recommended intake for almost anyone. A chocolate shake is 111 grams of sugar, so you're done for several days there. So some of the things you can do, certainly drinking more water, fruit-infused water, unsweetened teas, unsweetened vitamin waters, and then thinking about adding your own sweetener so you control how much is added. So even if you were to add a teaspoon of some type of sweetener to your tea, for example, it will be much less than the 30-some grams that you'll get if you buy it already sweetened. Yogurt is another good example. Plain yogurt has on average 12 grams of sugar per serving, and that is naturally occurring sugar. So that's the lactose. That's the sugar in milk that some people have a hard time digesting, but it's there naturally. And then if you buy a sweetened yogurt, it will often have added sugar up to 14 grams or more per serving. So an easy fix there is to buy the plain yogurt and either add fruit or sweeten it yourself with a much smaller amount of sweetener. So for example, a teaspoon of honey will add 4 grams instead of 14 grams. So getting very specific about that limiting intake of sugar-sweetened beverages, if you look at the amounts we just ran through, most people would exceed the recommended amount of sugar with one of those a day. So that helps us define what we mean by limit. Again, I realize most people know a lot of this, and there are things, life sometimes makes it very hard. Our lifestyle makes it hard to implement some of these guidelines, eating guidelines, activity guidelines. So an important thing is to try and plan ahead. So there's a saying, failing to plan is planning to fail. That can be very true when it comes to healthy eating and being active. So trying to plan your meals and snacks ahead of time. I mentioned cooking on weekends, or if you can plan your meals, get your groceries and do some cooking on the weekend, it will save you time during the week. I mentioned reworking whole grains and beans into different dishes throughout the week. During work, being familiar with the resources available at work and around you. So the planning ahead also applies to work. So you may have a separate list of snacks that you want to purchase on a regular basis and keep in your office, or if there's a refrigerator at work. So things like cut up vegetables with a bean dip, as I mentioned. There are a number of snack bars available now that have minimal ingredients. Some of them only have a few ingredients, fruits, nuts, and something like dates, or a small amount of sweetener to hold them together. Small amounts of nuts and dried fruits also can be kept in your desk. So thinking about having those available so you're less tempted to eat some of the other things that we may encounter in the workplace. Another thing that I think is helpful is thinking about things that you can prepare that take less than 30 minutes. So if you do some cooking on the weekends, you may have things available that you can rework into different meals, a stir fry, for example. But thinking about what types of meals you can prepare in 30 minutes when you get home from work, so that you don't have to worry about spending excessive time preparing meals when you're hungry. It's one of the reasons I like fish. Most fish can be prepared in well under 30 minutes with vegetables, and if you have a whole grain that you can heat up. Preparing meals ahead of time, as I mentioned, is helpful. So there are a number of resources available online and different cookbooks that, meals in 30 minutes or less. The other thing is the 6 to 8 to 9 hour meal using a slow cooker, which is one of the techniques I rely on very heavily. Putting it in the morning, and then your meal's ready when you come home. Preparing meals in the slow cooker on the weekend that again can be reworked throughout the week. I often prepare meals in a crock pot. We'll eat it for dinner, lunch the next day, and some of it we put away in the freezer so that day we get home from work and we don't have time to cook, we can heat that up. So again, mentioning keeping healthy snacks in your work drawer to avoid some of the office junk bowls, and then trying to remember to bring in a healthy treat when there are celebrations and events in the office. And you can't emphasize enough when we look at all of these foods, portion control is important. So we have serving size on labels, which I mentioned can be very helpful, particularly when we're looking at added sugars. But if the serving size is what gives us that information. If the portion we're actually eating is significantly larger, we're getting significantly more calories, sugar, etc. So to summarize, from the diet perspective, what should we be eating to do everything we can to lower our risk of cancer? The emphasis is on plants, so whole grains, fruits, vegetables, beans, and less on red meat. Trying to eat foods higher in nutrient density, so all of those plant-based foods, as I mentioned, are high in fiber, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and phytochemicals that can help keep our cells healthy, and eating less of the saturated and trans fats, eating more omega-3 fatty acids from fish. Some people also need to work on sodium and certainly sugar, trying to decrease avoided sugars in your diet. All of that can be very helpful with the number one recommendation we talked about, achieving and maintaining a healthy body weight. I want to close by really putting out a call to action. So think about some of the things we talked about today, and write down something that you may have heard that you know you can improve upon, and how you're going to address that starting tomorrow or in the very near future, and being as specific as possible. So if you're looking to eat more fruits and vegetables, maybe your action plan is something like eating 1 serving of vegetable and fruit with each meal most days over the next month, because most things take close to a month to become a habit. Or cutting down the amount of added sugar. Maybe you can't get down to 24 to 36 grams, but maybe you start by trying to get down to 50 grams for a month and then going lower if you can. Activity, adding activity a certain number of days a week for the next month. So think about something you might be able to improve upon, and write it down, maybe put it on your refrigerator, and then every month or so try and change something else. Again, behavior change is hard. One of the things we always encourage people is to think about what it is you're trying to achieve and why, how you're going to get there, and then think about what is the result or the consequences of not changing as it relates to your health and well-being. Some resources that may be helpful as you think about changing behaviors that might give you more ideas, recipes, tips, answer some questions are the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics at eatright.org, the American Institute for Cancer Research at AICR.org, the National Cancer Institute at cancer.gov, and the American Cancer Society at cancer.org. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you found this information on a healthy diet and cancer risk reduction helpful. For more information, please visit cancercenter.com.